Hello everyone, good afternoon. A very warm welcome to the Publishers Panel. My name is Schilz. I'm the Director of the Literary Consultancy, the UK's longest standing editing consultancy for writers, and I have the very great honour of being the chair for today. I have a personal interest in translation alongside my work in the literary sector. Many years ago, I was part of a development team for a Stephen Spender award-winning toolkit for schools that incorporated pupils' first languages into teaching methodology. And I had also had a brief stint at a publishing house writing readers' reports for translated excerpts under consideration by the editorial team. This panel is part of an advanced Scandinavian translation workshop, a 3-day programme for published Scandinavian to English literary translators, which is being run online by the British Centre for Literary Translation in partnership with the National Centre for Writing. We would like to thank our supporters, Arts Council England, the Danish Arts Foundation, NORLA, Norwegian Literature Abroad, and the Swedish Arts Council. This session will run for 1 hour, and we have reserved time at the end for Q&A. Please, therefore, do use the Q&A button, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, to leave your questions. And throughout this webinar session, you are also really welcome to leave comments, feedback and insight in the chat, which you'll also find at the bottom. Your contributions are highly valued as our peers in the field, and we would really love to hear from you and feel like we're in a room together. I know it's very difficult to create that feeling, but we'll try our very best. It's my immense pleasure to introduce your 3 guest publishers before we open up into a chat. Jade Chandler is Publishing Director of Baskerville at John Murray Press. Jade joined John Murray from Harville Secco in 2021 to launch the publisher's first dedicated crime list. Baskerville publishes books that haunt the imagination, I like that, whether that be via ghostly chills, atmospheric settings, or thought-provoking themes. The list is home to Sunday Times' #1 bestseller, Mick Herron, and includes translated titles such as 1795, The Order of the Furies by Niklas Natt och Dag, translated by Ian Giles, who you will have heard from if you're part of yesterday's sessions, and Lady Joker by Kaoru Takamura, translated by Alison Markin Powell and Marie Ida. Rory Williamson is a Scottish editor. He studied literature in Cambridge and Montreal and is now editor at Pushkin Press, where he works on classic and contemporary books in translation. And Kirsty Dunseath began her career at Jonathan Cape and then at the Women's Press in the 1990s. She went on to join Orion in 2002, where she remained for 16 years, publishing best-selling authors, including, most notably, Gillian Flynn, the correct pronunciation of whose name, in fact, she taught me, whose book Gone Girl has sold 4.3 million copies, Carlos Ruiz Zafón's The Shadow of the Wind, Laura Barnett's The Versions of Us, Michel Bussy's After the Crash, and the best-selling Call the Midwife series. With an interest in translated fiction, Kirsty's other authors include Arturo Pérez Reverte, Almudena Grandes, and Grégoire de la Cour. She joined Transworld PRH in 2019 as publisher of Doubleday, where she is now, and her authors there include Kate Atkinson, Donald Ryan, Catherine Newman, and Victoria Mast. So as you can see, an amazing panel. I'm very excited, and it's just such a privilege to be able to share a room and screen with you all. Thank you very much for being here. And so to kick us off, I have warned you that this will be my first question. What brings you here today? I'm just wondering, how in your current work do you work with translation, and what is most exciting about it to you? So I'm going to go on the order of my screen. Oh, and hello everyone in the chat telling us where you're joining from. This is fantastic. From Edinburgh, Cornwall, Massachusetts, Madrid, Texas, Ipswich, Finland, Bristol, Cambridge, Bangkok, Norwich, Staffordshire, Valencia. Amazing. Welcome to you all. Jade, let's start with you.
Hi everyone. And so many familiar names in the chat as well. Hi. And hello from Bristol, UK, where I'm based. And the thing that I'm most excited about is, so I'm a crime specialist publisher. And in my previous job for Harville Secco, it was a very traditional crime-focused publishing, which is great. But at Baskerville, I have a slightly wider remit. So as Aki mentioned, we just want to publish books on the imagination. So that has sort of opened up the sort of books I can commission outside of sort of classic crime and thriller tropes into sort of Gothic historical fiction, and hopefully soon some sort of horror adjacent fiction. So I'm really looking forward to expanding into those areas and hopefully incorporating some translated titles into those new areas as well.
Oh, exciting. Well, perhaps some of your future translators are in our audience today. Great. Rory, you're next on my screen.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I work at Pushkin, where translation's absolutely at the core of what we do, and it's always been that way. And it's been, that was where I got my first job in publishing. I'm still there, and I think that's because the whole process of publishing and translation just really excites me. And I think it's just something that ideally we're seeing sort of growing. And the most exciting thing to me at the moment really is classics publishing and translation, which again is at the core of what Pushkin does. But I think we're seeing more and more of these kind of really well published voices from other countries and other languages who are kind of canon in their own countries, but that we don't know in English. And that to me is just so exciting that, unfortunately, because our translation culture in English and in the UK is not as strong as other countries, there's a lot that we're kind of missing out on, a lot that we haven't read. But that also creates this opportunity to kind of help redress that. And I think it's a really lively area of publishing right now. And particularly in what we've published in the last few years, it's been where we've seen, a large portion of the readership come from and a lot of excitement emerge. So that's something that I find really exciting.
Great. Thank you, Rory. And actually, there's some stuff there that we can circle back to because I've already got some ideas. And Kirsty.
Hi. Well, we always just are looking for the most exciting new voices from around the world. So we're not a translationist per se. We're looking all around the world, America, Britain, France, Spain, Argentina, Japan. And it's just about finding those people who we think aren't just a one book phenomenon, but we can help grow careers. And it is really exciting because you never know where the next hot thing's going to come from, the thing that kind of changes the rules of the game. I know you're going to ask us about trends, but trends always start with someone who breaks out a new trend. And so you're always looking to see what's happening in other countries as well. And looking for that voice that you think can be a star of the future.
Thank you, Kirsty. And indeed, I am going to ask about trends because the topic of this publishers panel is technically trends, challenges, and perspectives. And that was the brief we were given to think about trends, challenges, and perspectives. Trends is a funny one because in a way they are delayed. Everything in publishing happens so slowly. A trend now might really have been an acquiring trend 12, 18 months ago. In another way, especially for working translators like we have in our audience, they're really important to be on top of, but also feel very slippery and very kind of mystical somehow, when hopefully they're not, and we'll be able to talk about that. But what do you see as the main drivers? So what's happening at the moment? What are the kind of hot topics and trends that you're aware of, where they intersect with translation? And what do you think those main drivers are at the moment for you? Who'd like to jump in with something they're noticing?
I'm happy to.
Go on.
I don't want to monopolize. I mean, obviously we're saying, I think we were talking just before this of the trend in kind of Japanese healing fiction, usually featuring a cat. And it's meant that, it's a very hot area, but it's also getting overinflated. Those books, to buy them, are becoming very, very expensive. And I reckon within a year or two, there'll be kind of too many of them. We'll be drowning in Japanese cat books and the market will have moved on. So actually commissioning wise, you have to think ahead. You have to think down that line. But in broader publishing perspectives, I think it's really interesting to see how horror and genre fiction and literary fiction are melding. And there's an immense appetite for those kind of slightly otherworldly speculative stories. And I think that opens up really interesting possibilities in translation.
Yeah, fantastic. How about either of you, Jade or Rory? Anything you've really noticed? Oh, Jade, you were jumping to get in there.
I was going to say, I think it's exactly what Kirsty just said, the latter part of that. But the world feels quite polarized at the moment, and I think books are no different. So you have this appetite for books that make you feel maybe a bit unsettled and explore new like territories and different boundaries, and it's in this sort of contemporary horror speculative area. And on the other hand, you have Japanese books about cats, but also just pure hits of feel good nostalgia. So I'm really interested to see if the trend in crime fiction, in particular for slightly cozier, nostalgic crime fiction, will translate, no pun intended, will cross over into translated crime fiction, because, you know, Scandinavian crime fiction ruled the roost for many years. And a lot of it is really grisly and very like conventionally, you know, on a sort of conventional thriller framework. So I'm really interested to see if we can make that segue next into in the translated crime market as well.
Rory, any thoughts on this?
I think kind of related to what both Jade and Kirsty have said, I think one of the things that I definitely see and I'm interested in is a kind of mixed genre focus that I think you're seeing all across both literary and in crime and speculative everywhere. But I think this kind of unusual blend of different genre elements is something that is exciting prize committees. I think you see it in the international booker lists from the last few years. But I also think it's something that's cutting across, particularly, as Kirsty says, in the kind of otherworldly and horror space, online, on TikTok and things like that, for instance. There's a lot of interest in this kind of thing. And a lot of these books are in translation. So I do think that sometimes there are maybe just the audiences are less familiar with certain kind of approaches to genre, and these are becoming exciting to readers. Or they just happen to, you know, the gems are just coming from other languages. I don't know, but that is definitely something we're noticing, and always something that draws me to a book or a proposal is it taking things I think I might know and then actually twisting them in some way.
You mentioned there actually, Rory, these TikTok trends, this sort of Netflix crossovers. You know, The Witcher caused this enormous influx of particular things. And also from early in the conversation, someone I can't remember who, it might have been you as well, Rory, mentioned that we're very strong at exporting, less so at importing. And then Jade, you said something about translated trends. I think there's something in there. I've got a question around how far, when you're looking outside of the English language for particular trends, and then you need to get the right writer, the right translator in, how far you were aware of kind of other cultural points of reference when you're doing this, or how far that's driven from something a bit more domestic. What's that relationship like for each of your publishers? Did that make sense as a question?
Actually, I think it really does, because there are books that are within a trend in their own language, but that you wouldn't necessarily translate because, as I think it was Rory was talking about, the point of difference. So every country has its own Wattpad self-published TikTok phenomenon in romance, but they aren't necessarily being translated, and that's because each country has its own. And it's based on a platform, and that person's platform is in their own language. So there are authors who are 1 million copy sellers in Spain who don't sell outside of Spain, or where the translations, where they have been translated, have sold a couple of thousand copies, which in some ways is good. But when you compare them being 1 million seller in Spain, so you've got those phenomena in each country, but you don't need them in your own language, because what you're looking for is point of difference.
Yes, and that goes back to your point about precedents as well, that the mold breakers are the thing that you're looking for. But actually, the metrics that you use are based on precedents and what has come before. So it's a very tricky balance, I think, to strike. Jade or Rory, any thoughts on this as well? On where you're looking for those patterns?
Sorry, Rory.
On you go, please.
I was just going to say I am a monoglot, very embarrassed to say, and so I'm really reliant on other people telling me what's going on in other cultures in languages that I can't speak. So for me, you know, that's rights agents, literary agents, and sometimes translators, you know, that I know will tell me what they're reading and they're interested in. So yeah, I feel like I'm on full receive mode, but I feel that I don't have that much control over how much extra information I can get bar asking people. So it's a really interesting and sort of quite a one-way process for someone like me.
Well, I wonder whether I could throw this question out to our audience as well, because actually you're our experts on all things Scandinavian. So if there are things that you think we're missing out on as an industry, that you think these are the things that are happening, maybe not trends, maybe that's a slightly too commercial word, but things that you think should be coming from Scandinavian territories, languages and authors that we're not quite getting, please pop them in the chat. Please let us know what they are. You may spark a revolution. You may spark the new thing that's going on in publishing, and we can credit the British Centre for Literary Translation for that. So please do, you're part of this panel too, our lovely audience members. But we're talking here about kind of market demand, who's reading what. Market demand really means readers. It's people. I think we can talk in these really lofty, abstract terms sometimes, but it's all about readers. And just before this, we were having a really interesting discussion about who is reading translated fiction and kind of how you're reaching your readers and what you're learning from them. I know some publishers have kind of spent millions on insight, consumer insights and things like that. But the Booker Foundation recently released a report that we were just discussing that shows that 48% of current consumers of translated fiction are under the age of 35, compared to the general population of fiction buying UK citizens, which is 60 plus, actually. Skews much older. And we were talking about how this is affected by, like you were saying, Kirsty, influxes in particular kinds of fiction that are being brought in. For example, manga at the moment is really skewing that. But how far are you learning or listening to readers, and how do you do that? What's that dialogue that you as publishers have with readers, if any? And how does it look for each of you? I'm always fascinated by this kind of behind the scenes stuff. Rory, I feel like I come to you last every time, so why don't you go first this time?
And a big question. I mean, I also find it really fascinating that apparently there is a kind of, younger people are a large part of the audience for translators' work. I do wonder if some of it speaks to there still being a bit of a split in the publishing industry's minds and in some readers' minds about what is in translation or what is not, and that translated work is sometimes thought of as being kind of where you find the sort of new, fresh stuff that might be appealing to a younger audience. But at the same time, that feels like a relatively small aspect of the concern. But in terms of interactions with readers, I mean, that's in every way, really. I mean, it's, from where we're sending our proofs to people who are involved in book, marketing in some way, or influencers, but also just talking to booksellers, pulling their thoughts, all that kind of thing, social media. You just kind of, in all sorts of ways, try to figure out who the core audience is. And I think with Pushkin in particular, because we're quite small, we do have a bit of an idea sort of what the audience likes, not necessarily the demographic, but, we publish with a point of view, and that's kind of reflected in our engagement that we get. So that's kind of where we'd have our sort of core idea. But sometimes it can also be somewhat mysterious as well. Books take on a life of their own, and then you start seeing it, and you're like, oh, wow, that conversation over there. So a book that we published, for instance, Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Bastarrica, became a TikTok hit, and now we see people responding to it all the time. And that's a really interesting thing to see as well, as people recording things like reaction videos to a book that you published sort of 3 years ago. And you think, wow, this is why it's impacted this person and these people, and here's what's kind of captured the imagination. So that's a way as well when you kind of see it having an impact or a public kind of discussion happening too.
What about you, Jade?
Yeah, social media, we could lose hours of our working lives watching reader reactions, and that's such a great example, Rory. And yeah, we have, John Moe Press is part of Hachette UK, so it's a big corporate publisher, so we have a consumer insight team, and some of that can be really interesting. But as an editor, you're one step removed from that. So for me, it's priceless to see like real-time reactions to what people are reading, and also my most sort of frequent port of call to see what readers are picking up is just speaking to booksellers, and particularly in indie bookshops. And here in Bristol we have so many indie bookshops, it's amazing. I think there's 8 of them now or something, And the last time I went round, it was a couple of months ago, and I asked everybody what's selling, and almost all of them said Japanese translated fiction, and I was like, okay. So, there are clear trends in the local area as well that you can tap into, and I feel very lucky to be able to go in and have those conversations in person.
Amazing. I should say also, works translated into Sweden were featured in the top 10. They were at number 7. So don't despair, audience. Kirsty,
I think what Jade and Rory were saying. You could spend your life trying to find out what readers think, and it is about observing what's happening in the market, what's getting lift off, what's not getting lift off, and why it's not. And you can, We are always trying to expand our network of bloggers and influencers, but talking to booksellers, we do get feedback, and we do have consumer insight. And just listening to what people are talking about in the wider milieu, in the wider media, and where those interests lie and how that can dovetail with fiction. With fiction, for me, non-fiction obviously is translated as well. And just kind of always keeping in mind what is universal, because the best books in translation have something special that's unique to them, but they also touch on universal experience. It's that universality which can really drive the book sales. And I think, going back to what you were saying, Jade, I think that's one reason these kind of healing books are doing well at the moment, because the world is quite a scary place, and that and the kind of nostalgia for the cozy crime speaks to what people are looking for in their reading experience at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And just from the chat there, I should just honour the voices of those who've contributed here. Scandinavian authors also write cozy crime. Noted, Ruth, thank you. Young adult fantasy is really coming through, apparently. A lot of interesting fiction about parenthood coming out of Denmark right now, some of which is being translated, so maybe there's a little call to action. So lots of interesting stuff, and thank you for your contributions, our lovely audience. I'm just sorry we can't see all of your faces and be more in communication with you, but thank you for your chat there. And I'm also noting that you are using the Q&A function, so thank you for that. That's brilliant. It's on the bottom left-hand side. We will be in about 20 minutes going to questions. So if you do have a burning question that's not yet been answered, please put it in there. And just a small question, really, I guess, about how, as this relates to the people in the audience who are going to be, a lot of them jobbing translators. That doesn't mean that, of course, that career is secure. Recently, I think today, an article was released by the Society of Authors on the cost of living crisis and a huge spike in hardship fund applications. And interestingly, in that article, they were getting applications from people with portfolio jobs and careers working in illustration, journalism, editing, and translation. So there is a precarity here, which I'm hoping that we can tackle a little bit with this panel. One of the questions then is, when you are working with translators directly, how far is all of this awareness of all of this stuff important when they're pitching their work, and what does that pipeline currently look like for you, and how do you think it might be improved? It's a very direct question. I hope you'll forgive me for asking it. How are you currently working with translators, and what would you hope in an ideal world if you could make it even better than it is now? Who wants to jump in? Someone be brave. Otherwise, I will be a school teacher, and I'll Kirsty, you're smiling at me, so go ahead.
Oh, do you know how it could actually be improved? Is that through more translation happening, and how that can be improved is the infrastructure that happens at the beginning. We'd love to be polyglots and to speak lots of different languages, but teaching languages in the UK is kind of on a slide in terms of the cultural. It is culturally valuable, but let's get political. I don't think the current powers that be value teaching languages as much as in the past, or as much as in any other country. So if you imagine, we're bombarded with projects, and it's easiest to buy in your own language, but you always know that there could be real gems out there. some countries are really set up extremely well, and the Scandinavian countries thankfully are, for giving you a really good chunk in translation first, so that you can really get a sense of the original, and getting the sense of that original is so important. A reader's report is great, but getting a sense of the writing is what you're looking for. So the more agents that do that, and the more kind of those grants are provided for working with translators to give you a really good chunk of the book so as you can properly read it, and so as you can share it internally with your marketing, sales and publicity team. Because even when you do read the language, you can say, this is a great book in French, and they'll look at you and go, well, we can't read it, so convince us. So if you have a chunk of it, that's really great. I mean, working with translators is always great, and you have to be finding the books that they can translate. And so I suppose it's a bit chicken and egg, isn't it? You know, the more access you have to literature from other countries, the more you'll be looking in translation, the more translation projects there will be for translators.
Okay, very wide-ranging. Thank you, Kirsty. Rory, your thoughts on this?
Just as what specifically you meant in terms of pipeline and things. I got a little bit lost, so I'd like to just be able to focus.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So, well, just how you're currently sourcing and finding and working with translators, and then in an ideal world, what would that look like?
Well, I mean, we do it in all sorts of ways. Often we'll get proposals directly from translators, in which case we'll work with those translators if we take the project on. We have a big network of translators that we've worked with in the past because we've been doing so much translation for such a long time, but we're always looking to expand that. And I'm in particular very conscious that there are a lot of emerging translators out there that also really should get work, and it's great to be able to offer that where the project is right. So keeping an eye on the field, basically, which involves, reading a lot of new translations, seeing who translate them, and, I'll read something, I'll admire it, and I'll note it, and I'll think, wow, this was great, I'd love to work with this person. And seeing that also, a lot of people emerge in literary magazines, and I keep up with Words Without Borders or with other literary magazines in translation. And again, that's sometimes where you'll see something and you'll think, oh yeah, great. And as I sort of, I'm commissioning more and more and looking into try to expand the languages that we translate from. And Kirsty's point about grants is absolutely right. I think I wish there were more, basically, because it can be very hard to, without the infrastructure, get the material you need to convince a team to move on a book and make that financial investment to publish it. And so, there are good, really positive developments. The thing I was going to mention as well about excitement is the South Asian Literature and Translation project that Daniel Han, I think, has launched this year, which is doing grants to get publishing professionals from the English-speaking world to South Asia on trips to meet with publishers and agents. I think they're also going to be launching translation grants. I think it's tremendously exciting to see a kind of new infrastructural support for publishers, and I very much hope to take advantage of that if I can apply successfully in the near future, because that was something that in the last year I just found incredibly cheering. So again, about that kind of look to expand, all of those things are really helpful and really encouraging.
Great. It's also fantastic to hear, Rory, that you're very active in looking at, in the literary magazines, looking at the names, looking at interesting bits from emerging translators who might not have had a full-length thing looking. So hopefully that's reassuring to our audience. I know that you're all advanced and you're probably incredibly savvy, but even so, it's good to know that publishers are actively out there looking for newer names in different languages. So literary magazines, prizes, kind of grants, and also often grants schemes. If you're lucky enough to get one, they will list names of people that they have supported. So that's another place that people can be looking. Jade, how does it work with Baskerville and kind of how you find people and work with them?
Well, I was just thinking that every acquisition that we make at the moment there is an even fiercer look at costs at the point of acquisition. So this is the opposite to Rory's cheerful point. But as an editor, when you take a project to the rest of the team and say, this is fantastic, we've got to publish it, It's okay, well, how many we're going to sell and how much they're going to cost us to get to the point of starting to sell those copies. And obviously translation is an added cost. So what I'm really hoping for is that, outside of countries with good existing grant systems, like in Scandi, crime in the past, the funding for that just keeps improving, because being able to apply for grants for something that is, particularly something that's on the more literary end of genre publishing, of crime writing, not at the more commercial end, the sales prospects are probably smaller. So I basically need to be able to say to the team, well, here's the funding I can add into the equation for how much it's going to cost us to publish this book. And this is, part of like checks and balances, making it work for the powers that be, essentially. So, yeah, whether it's going to happen or not, I don't know, but I'm hopeful. And the more we can all spread the positive word about translation, the more funding will hopefully crop up.
Really sounding like actually a bit more infrastructure is needed. There is some, but actually it pales in comparison to particular territories and countries where this kind of thing is valued more. And Kirsty, you were also talking about kind of socio-political, contextual infrastructure, and I think that's really important actually, and probably something we need to be very aware of. Even so, I think that we've got to talk about pay. We've talked about this beforehand, but I do think it's really important because, we can say this is what we want, these are the challenges. Now, on the understanding that no one is here today to describe an official company position on exactly how what is paid at what rates. However, we cannot have this chat without talking about pay and talking about fair remuneration for translators, what the state of things is now, what it needs to be, where the challenges are, because there is resistance here. And I'm just interested in what the challenges really are. So, Jade, I know that you've just gone, but actually I might come to you first because you've very, very sensibly and prudently talked about there are cost implications. Part of that, obviously, is making sure you're building in pay. And we were talking a bit about models before, should there be a kind of profit sharing thing like the Frank Wynne a provocation from a couple of very controversial amongst agents and publishers? Is it kind of like, what's the sort of royalty split? Where is the visibility? Where's the value? So just in general terms, how are we feeling about the way things are structured now? What would you like to see from what do you think your role as a publisher is my challenge to you in thinking about fair pay for translators in the same way that we think about illustrators or whatever? What do you think, Jade?
Well, I mean, I think about it in the same way as I think about an advance I would pay to an author of a book in English. So for me, it's just as important to pay for the translator to be remunerated properly. But there are cost implications at the moment. So the increasing cost of just everything in the world, the price of paper, the price of production, the price of shipping, all of that is squeezing publisher margins, and the businesses exist to make money. So we have to, as editors, show why we think this project can make money. So I guess the thing I would like to see, my experience of working in different publishers on translation is that the model is all over the place. And there are different sort of models agreed, sometimes with different translators, even within the same publishing house across different imprints. So I think what would be better is if there was a more uniform, more supportive approach for everybody, that kind of, made things more equal, and also really helped younger translators or people who've just started translating to get a leg up into the industry. I don't know if I'm living in some sort of crazy, hopeful world where that could happen, but I would love to see it happen.
I would hope thinking that something could be standardized or centralized wouldn't be a crazy thought. And maybe that speaks to something else going on in publishing, the structures at play. Any thoughts from you, Rory or Kirsty, about pay models and structures and sort of best practice?
Sort of picking up what you said, I can see, the kind of fair playing field for everyone and the standardized pay. Just thinking about that and thinking about translators I've worked with, when a translator has become prize winner and recognized in their own right, there are some Spanish language translators, you know, who become almost, their name is almost as big as the author's name because they're so recognized. It's different. You can't expect them to accept the same rate as someone who's doing their first translation. And I think it's the same as with authors. Someone who's doing a debut is different to someone who's won the Booker Prize. So there'll always be a need to vary what you're doing according to who's translating the book. And is that unfair? I don't know. Doesn't a translator earn the right to demand for more if they've achieved prizes and a kind of stellar recognition for their name? But it is all over the place. I completely agree, because the ideal is that you pay a good kind of society author rate and royalty. To pay a translator a royalty, you have to get the agreement that the author doesn't ask for the top end royalty. So, you know, if you're paying 10% to the author and the translator wants 1%, that it's 9 and 1, so that you end up at 10, because as Jade say, you still have the same P&L, profit and loss statement. You still have the kind of economics of how to make it work. And you don't want to end up at a starting point for royalties that's higher than it would be for an English language book. And many, many authors are very happy to do that because they value the work of the translators. Equally, sometimes they're not. They say, well, why should I give some of my share? And that's where it becomes quite intractable. And that's where you might go to a fee basis.
Gosh, it's really complicated, isn't it? Very but I think there's a problem with it being so higgledy-piggledy. Rory, what's your experience?
I mean, relatively similar in the sense that you do see a fair bit of differentiation, though I'd say that there is, from our perspective, a little bit more, not standardization, but you try to keep things as a sort of like, there is maybe the don't go below this kind of bar, because it is some, you know, I think as consciousness has been raised of the kind of necessity of this, which is obviously just absolutely necessary, that it needs to be fairly remunerated. It's still, I wish that there could be more to be done on that front. There are obviously other models, as people are talking about, with royalties. Again, that's ideal. You see it more and more, I think, now, and more people are asking for it, as they should do, but it'd be nice if it were a more kind of expected thing. We have also had instances, again, as Kirsty describes, where you take to sort of share some of the royalty between author and translator. I would quite like to see more of a culture of that, I think, but or some kind of in between where there is a, you know, it's not exactly the same. Maybe there is a slight increased translation royalty in that way, but, you know, always making sure that that is factored into the cost sort of consideration, that like the seat at the table for the translator has to be there in the cost and that they're fully accounted for. And that there are other models of profit sharing in a way as well, whether it's sharing some portion of a grant that you get if you're successful, which can be really helpful, and things like that. So I think there are other routes. We just have to kind of be maybe more creative with them when the margins are really low and the costs are really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. So very, very hard in practice. And actually, again, audience, this is where we would love to hear from you. If you've seen particular models that work really well, or examples of things that have worked for you, please do share them, because this is a learning space for us as well. You know, we've got the opportunity, 3 publishers in the room with a room full of 83 professional translators. We really, really actively want to hear from you. If you've seen best practice, if you've seen models that really work, please share them. Please share them in the chat, pop a question in the Q&A. I'm going to open out in a few minutes, actually, to make sure that we've got time for all of your questions, because that's super, super important. And thank you for your comments in the chat as well. We are reading all of them, and they're incredibly useful and some really valuable feedback in there. So thank you. The final kind of big topic that I want to address before we go on to audience Q&A, because we've got lots of audience Q&A, thank you so much for that, is we have given you 5 minutes to talk about AI, but we must address this. It's such a hot topic. I also think it's difficult to get into because AI actually isn't one thing. It's not a homogenized thing. It's applied in different ways, and machine learning is used in some ways that are very useful. Automated processes are incredibly useful. On the other hand, specifically around intellectual property and copyright and the really difficult grey areas where we've already got a content creator, the writer, but then we've got layers of additional content, including the translator. I just would really love to hear whether this is, from the outside, it feels like it's a kind of burning building. From the inside, what's it really looking like? What are your main thoughts on, conversations about, anxieties about, or, excitement about AI when it comes to copyright and content? Maybe it doesn't factor at all. I don't know. What's it looking like from behind the scenes, behind the closed doors of publishing houses? Kirsty, I'll come to you again for this one.
Okay. Oh, well, I mean, it's a huge, huge subject. I think there is the preservation of copyright for translators and for authors. That's extremely important. And the preservation of copyright extended into those translations and those books not being fed into ChatGPT to create a new thing. It is copyright. It shouldn't be used in that way. So I know that the Publishers Association is lobbying the government on this issue. I think before in our chat before this, I mentioned at the Frankfurt Book Fair there was a book that we suspect may have been generated by AI. I think that is something that will continue to happen. But I think in most areas of culture, we look for the really excellent creators, and that'll be the same in translation. Google Translate can translate things in a very bad, clunky way, but if you want a translation a translator is part translator, part writer. They bring their own creative juices to the translation, and that's why a translation by someone who is a trained translator can bring all those little things to make it really interesting. So I think as far as I'm concerned, I think as long as we're preserving the rights of the creator, and that means the author and the translator and the illustrator, then we preserve our culture.
I'm really glad to hear that, Kirsty. I hope for the audience that's also a relief, because I think there's some, I don't want to speak for you, lovely audience. Please, again, put in the chat your own thoughts, but I'm assuming there's quite a lot of anxiety around using this to prop up things, including translation. So I hope it's a rousing rallying cry from Kirsty that, yes, we continue to value original translation. Any other things coming up for you, Jade or Rory, in this area that are useful to bring to the table?
I'm generally, it's very scary, just in a world sense as well as in a publishing and translation sense. But I think they could be positives. So let's try and think of one. In a publishing house, there are so many sort of administrative things that editors need to do that even 10 years ago we didn't have to do, and it's all to do with feeding data and information out to retailers because the market has shifted to be so heavily focused online. And I think it would be great if some of that could be automated. I'm not talking about creative work in any respect, but if there is a way that some of that administrative workload could be taken away from editors, it would free up so much time to spend doing things that connect people with people, editors with translators, editors with foreign publishers. You spend time traveling around the world, on grants to try and discover new writing talent. That for me feels like a little positive grain that I'm clinging on to.
Definitely. So anything that we can use to improve systems, which frees up time, capacity, and therefore budget to do things like better pay for translators. Ultimately, that wraps our kind of discussion here, and I want to go straight into the audience Q&A. So thank you so much. We'll try and get through as many of these as possible and wrap on time. So we've got a question about supply and demand ratio between translators available to you and texts that need translating. So actually there's a question around, is it that there's loads of demand, little supply, too much supply? What is that balance? I think that's probably if one of you has an answer to that. Does anyone know? From your experience?
it's quite hard
Or
to.
do you want to say?
Yeah, I feel like it's quite hard to say because it's very hard to visualize when you have a text that you want to translate. Who's all out there, and who's I do feel like there probably are, at least from an individual standpoint, obviously far more translators than there are texts that we need to get translated. But that's not always the case in different languages as well, where sometimes you'll find that at least you don't know of many translators from this language, or there's a lot of demand for a specific language, which is happening as we see, I think, most of all with Japanese at the moment. And so it depends really on the project. Yeah, I would say that. But, I do think there's always, it feels like finding the right translator is always kind of what you're trying to do, rather than thinking about it in a sort of supply-demand nexus, maybe.
Yes, absolutely. I'm seeing some nodding in agreement. Generally,
I think sometimes also
seems about right.
Yeah, I think also sometimes the person you're buying the book from, the foreign publisher or agent, has views on who they might want to translate their author's books, or they want input, or they want approval of the translator choice. So then sometimes you have to be getting samples and things like that.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to, sorry, Anna, to the upvoted ones, because they're the ones where we've got lots of votes on them. We've got a popular question here from someone anonymous who asked, are editors open to pitches from translators? And I think that really slides on from what you were saying about having particular translators already in mind. So with that in mind, would you be open as editors to pitches from translators in-house? Is that something that's possible? How does that work? How does a translator who's not known to you approach you?
Sometimes they do. And it's a difficult one because there is a slight inherent conflict. And if they're approaching you, obviously they want the translation job. And then what if you buy the book and you don't give them the translation job because the person selling you has this other person in mind? I think that's where it can become complicated. I mean, I think editors always want to hear about great literature that we might not have heard of.
Okay. And then, Jade, I might come to you with a very direct question about this. A perfect, like someone's pitching to you and it's like the best pitch you've ever seen. What kind of ingredients does it have?
Oh, the best pitch.
A translator, yeah.
Okay, best pitch gives you a very clear hook. I'm talking about genre fiction here, so mainly.
Yeah.
So I want a hook. I want to know why it's distinctive, and as is the want with the publishing industry, I would like to know what it can compare to, because especially if I can't read the language, or if there's only a small sample, I'd like to know a sense of where it sits in the market, and what have other readers read who would also like this, essentially. Yeah, is that helpful?
Right. Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and I'm sure you're all seasoned at pitching, but good to hear it straight from a publisher directly. This is what I would look for. I would look for the hook, I would look for the comps, I would look for market awareness, and why you're the best person to deliver as the translator. Right, whipping through these because we've got so many questions here. Another really popular one: could editors share something that a translator has done that they wish more translators would do? Any kind of best practice that they could emulate? Lots of votes on this one.
That's a big question. Double space your translation. No, sorry, that was a bit of a facetious one. When you get it all in single, you have to turn it into double. I think the really good translators also alert you to quirks of the manuscript, or little anomalies that they might have noticed as they go through. So they're reading with the translation eye, but with also the editorial eye. That's really good. If they say to you, well, I remember one translation I was working on with the translator, and we realized that there were many more words to smile in Spanish than there are in English. And so we were able to talk to the author and say, we're not going to be able to replicate this, so we're going to have to go a bit left field in the way we translate this, because otherwise you're going to have your characters smiling a lot. So I think that it's someone who brings that little extra eye to the translation.
Yeah. Gosh, hard to define and hard to sort of really create, I guess. And anything else from Rory or Jade there?
That level of communication is something that can be really great, and particularly maybe at an earlier part of the process than they may think is best to do. Basically feeling that the lines of communication are open. If you do have something that might become a problem, it can actually sometimes be easier to address it at that early stage, so that you're kind of both sure of where things are going, rather than have a kind of delivery and then, oh, by the way, I found this and I did this, but actually you find, oh, maybe another approach might have been better. And I think also, sometimes trying things out. I mean, I think, there are so many paths for translation for text that have particular voices that if you think, oh God, this calls for this approach, but I'm not sure it's working. Can you read a page or two of what I've done and let me know if they feel ready to do that? I think that kind of collaboration, it can be really great. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And that's why, I mean, I've not been told by BCLT to say this, but that's why these things are good as well, because you can talk to your fellow translators, obviously not in this webinar setting, but for the workshops that you were doing yesterday, talking to fellow translators, getting really up to speed on what everyone else is doing. You can really learn from each other, collaborate, and unionize. Right, we've got a question about editors. Do editors go out, and this has been upvoted as well, do editors go out and actively look for titles to acquire from abroad, e.g. investigating what their peers in France, Germany, wherever are publishing, or do they rely exclusively on what literary agents present to them? Interesting. Your approaches may differ, so it'd be interesting to hear from each of you on this.
For me, it's very much focused around...
Go ahead, Jade.
For me, it's very much focused around book fairs. So meeting, in London, the London Book Fair particularly, being able to meet my counterparts from all around the world who may not actually be even selling the rights to a book themselves, but will say, I've read this person, they're amazing, just because we all do this job because we love reading, and we just talk about books all the time. So, and we want to hear about books that other people love. So that for me, face to face, in person, human connection and sharing a love of reading is sort of how I find books.
Okay. Rory?
It's a mix. I mean, obviously, hearing from agents and foreign publishers when they have a whole proposal together is often the easiest way. But at the same time, particularly as an independent publisher, where it is sort of, if there's a big competition for something, we will usually lose out money-wise or something like that. We kind of have to try to look a bit further afield in a way. I can read pretty well in Spanish, so I try actively to look at the Spanish market that way. And I'm trying to do that more and more. And also hearing from translators, I mean, to go back to the earlier question, I mean, we do, again, because translations are the core of what we do, and has, many of the titles we publish have come from those kinds of proposals, always being open to that and trying to kind of read those and look that way as well. Yeah.
Hey, Kirsty, what about you? Yeah, so I mean, it is a mix. Obviously, we go to book fairs, but we meet as many editors as we meet rights people and agents at those. And you do build up relationships with certain agents who you've met over the years and who you keep seeing, and they sometimes tip you off about something. But equally, it's the general conversations, like the Frankfurt Book Fair. There was a book from Finland that was the hot translated book of the fair that I heard about through a Dutch editor who said, have you seen this book? So we have a lot of those conversations, and also, when you travel, you love it. It's really nice to go into bookshops and just have a look. And I do always, in the languages I speak, in French and Spanish and German, I look at Amazon just to see if there's any anomalies there and why they're selling, and then you discover that they're a famous actor who's written a novel, and you're like, okay, right, I get that. Or there's something that's more real than that. There's a book that's getting a kind of head of steam in its own language. It's where, some languages, Scandinavian languages, were very well set up. The lines of communication are very open, and there's some great publishing houses and agents who communicate very frequently. It's where some other languages don't benefit as much, but Scandinavian languages, I would say the communication is excellent.
Great. This is really good to hear, and hopefully heartening for our audience members as well. And it's half answered, or 2/3 answered another question from an anonymous person here, asking if you read in other languages yourselves. I'm assuming that, Rory and Kirsty, you've just said that you do. I don't think that's a general expectation. Jade, do you happen to? No. I think that's fine. That's fine. But how it would not. So, in fact, that might be a follow-on, which is what was implicit, perhaps, is how that's done. Which is presumably via people that you outsource. Is that right? If it was a language you didn't read yourself, I think the question there is.
Yeah, so we commission readers' reports. If there isn't any material to read, but quite often, particularly with Scandinavian submissions, as I think Kirsty said earlier, they will have translated a good chunk, which is so helpful. I always feel really relieved when I get a submission like that, because it just makes it easier to convince everybody else when they can also read that this is a book we should publish.
Yeah, with that book from Finland, for example, there were 60 pages translated, and then there was a very full synopsis that told you exactly what happened in the rest of the novel. Sadly, we didn't get it. MacLeod's got it.
Oh, it happens. It happens to the best. Right, I'm afraid we're not going to have time for all of the questions. I think we have looked at readership and demographics, so I won't ask that question. Has the number of titles you publish and translation increased, decreased, or have there been any changes over the last 10 or 5 years? So that's specific to your publishing. So the statistic is at the moment it's about 11%. It was the dreaded 3% previously, but it hasn't been that way for a while now. It's now about 11%. But have you in your jobs noticed increases and decreases? Rory, how about you? Because I think you're probably the best working most in this area.
I think in a way my answer might be the most boring, which is that it's basically the same. Because it's the core of what we do. We're still doing it. We're not going to stop. That's kind of the answer. But I think we're trying to expand in the different kinds that we do. But at the same time, partly speaking to that, I think other publishers are doing more, and you see that. And it's a different playing field, in acquisitions. That's from what I hear from everyone who's been doing it for a long time. Now, is that larger publishers are, doing it more. They've been seeing success, and obviously they're kind of following that in a way. So it's changing, but at least the rate of it, I don't think is different. But I think the kind of overall terrain is definitely different.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, given that that's the bread and butter for you, that would be a roughly sort of steady trajectory. And how about you, Kirsty?
I think it's a really, really hard one to answer, because translation is such a big descriptor, isn't it? I would say that in certain areas more things are being translated, and that's great. And I would say in other areas less so. As I mentioned earlier, those big prize-winning books perhaps aren't getting as much attention as the books that fit into a trend. But that's just an observation. That might not be right at all.
Fair enough. I do have a final question, which I will ask you to each give a pithy response to, because it feels like a really good one to end on. I'm so sorry if we didn't get to your question. Hopefully there'll be more opportunities to continue asking them from the BCLT and otherwise. And to all fellow translators, we really hope that you've enjoyed this session. But the final question, where I'm going to ask you a kind of lightning round of one top tip. The question is, how can new translators best get in touch with or become visible to publishers and position themselves to get translation jobs? If you each had one practical tip for somebody who's looking to get themselves in front of a publisher and to get noticed, what would that one tip be?
Can I go first?
Yeah, go ahead too.
Go ahead, Jade. Yeah.
I was just going to say, this might not be helpful, but a referral. So if I know quite a lot of translators, and if somebody that I respected said there's this great new young translator on the scene, I would definitely pay more attention straight away. So buddy up with somebody kind and well respected, and that would be a good way to get an editor's attention.
My community is so important. Rory, what's your top tip?
I think probably, I mean, this is maybe is a bit basic, but be proactive. Try to work with agents and foreign publishers to do samples of work that you're interested in. Submit samples of that work if that isn't happening as well. Generally, just kind of like try to get your foot in the door that way. That's what we see, and that is the easiest way for it to kind of land in the inbox. It's just how it's going to happen, basically.
Great. I'm just going to add a very small tip thing on the end of that tip, which is that obviously please don't exhaust yourself sending out loads and loads of translation samples that you have not gained any money on. Maybe do an energy audit and really look after your mental well-being. It's so important, and it's often missed in these conversations, but it's important. Budget your energy and your time in the same way that you would money, because they are resources. Kirsty, your final top tip for getting in front of publishers as a translator.
Well, it's really echoing what Rory said and what Nikki said in the chat, is that, gosh, it's a godsend. If you get a submission and there's a sample and you think that's a really good translation, you automatically, you want to buy the book and you've already know who you think would do a really good job on this book and who's already engaged with it. So I think just make, as you say, not sending them out willy-nilly, but making those relationships with agents and publishers and being the person who's got your sample going out and talking to them about books that they're going to be selling and building that relationship, because that gets you right in front of our eyes straight away.
Amazing. So everyone, buddy up, become friends with your fellow translators, build a community, protect yourselves, be proactive where you can, listen to what else is trending, be where the publishers are. If they're at the fairs, obviously don't bombard them with a portfolio, but if they're at the fairs, be there, be part of that mix, be part of that conversation, part of that fabric. We've run over by 2 minutes, which is highly uncharacteristic for me as a German woman who respects timekeeping. So I do apologize. But thank you all so much. There's just so much richness in this room. It's been an absolute pleasure. Particular thanks to Jade Chandler, to Rory Williamson, and to Kirsty Dunseath, to all of you for being here, and to Anna and the whole team at the British Centre for Literary Translation for hosting. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. We really appreciate it. And we hope to see your translations on bookshelves in the very near future.